Hey everybody, this is a video about a year in the making, so I apologize for the lateness. When I was approached with this topic, it was the beginning of the pandemic we are currently in. Someone wanted to know the answer of the question of what the world would be like if somehow World War I had been averted. I hesitated on the question, as I didn't know if I could hypothesize on it. Counterfactual history has always been somewhat difficult for me. As I thought about it more, I thought that maybe really to get to the heart of this question, we had to start with a different question. And that question was the war avoidable at all? If the war wasn't avoidable, then there's no sense in hypothesizing as to what the world would look like because it just wouldn't even be a possibility. If the war was avoidable, then we could start to get into the details of maybe what a post non-World War I world would look like. In the video to follow, I'm going to explore this topic and if the war was avoidable, and what the world might look like if it was. So, to get started on this question, I really had to look at the evidence in favor of World War I being unavoidable. And there are many scholars and historians who do believe that truly this was the case. I love this simplistic picture because I do think that it does drive home a very important point leading up to World War I. And that point is that there was an overzealous adherence to alliances with foreign countries leading into the war. You can see in the picture that this intertwining alliance turned what could have been a very small conflict between just two countries into an all-out brawl between all of Europe. As much as I love this picture, there is some information missing within it. This does a good job of depicting the overzealous alliances, but it doesn't talk much about the balance of power that had existed in Europe and how this balance of power contributed to making this such an all-encompassing war for the continent. So I'll take a stab at explaining this balance of power, and it really does go back 100 years to the Congress of Vienna. The purpose of the Congress of Vienna was to prevent another Napoleonic-style conflict from engulfing Europe ever again. Of course, the problem with the Congress of Vienna is that it was based on an 1815 map of Europe. By 1914, the situation had changed. The thing that the Congress of Vienna had not accounted for was the rise of Germany in the 1870s. As a result of the rise of Germany, and the defeat of the French in the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, you had many of the older powers of Europe, like Britain and France, become very concerned about the rise of a new power that might destabilize Europe. As a result, the two powers allied together. Germany, to kind of counterbalance this, looked for allies, but they didn't find particularly many, specifically of the same strength of Britain or France. So they allied with the other sick man of Europe. And no, I'm not talking about the Ottoman Empire. I'm talking about Austria-Hungary. Okay, so what you have here, okay, just in these two alliances, and Italy would later join up with Austria-Hungary and Germany, and then betray them, of course, once the war started. And Russia would later join up with Britain and France. What you had here was an alliance between a rising power that probably was going to become the most powerful country in Europe prior to World War I. Then you had Britain and France, who were both powerful in their own right, though probably not to the level of Germany prior to World War I. And then there was Austria, who was not as strong as Britain or France, certainly, and nowhere near the power of Germany. So the issue isn't just the alliances, it's the fact that the alliances were such that both sides believed that they could win. Because they were evenly matched, no one saw themselves at a huge disadvantage going into this conflict, which made conflict more likely. Another idea contributing to the war was the application of the ideas of Darwinism to nations themselves. In the minds of those running the countries, nations were exactly like species. And the political world was much like the biological world. If your nation did not remain the fittest, it would die, just as a species would die. With this in mind, it made backing down from conflict a difficult thing to do, because backing down would show weakness, and weakness would contribute to the demise of the country. This philosophy also led to an all or nothing type deal, where either you were going to win the war, and to be defeated in war was to be as good as dead as a people and a nation. This idea of social Darwinism also carried through to the way that the military leadership was taught at the time. The generals at the time, in both the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, had this idea of the cult of the offensive. And the idea of the cult of the offensive was essentially that you needed to strike first and you needed to strike decisively to gain an advantage and win the conflict. If you didn't strike first, well, then that might lead to your inevitable demise, much like we talked about with the social Darwinism piece. Because nations were incentivized to strike first, this made a war far more likely to break out, as aggressive nations are far more bellicose than those who are simply trying to defend themselves or who plan their wars based on defending themselves. This idea of striking first sort of cancels out one of the most often cited examples of why maybe World War I wasn't inevitable. The Willie-Nicky telegrams are usually cited as a way that the war could have been avoided. When you read through these telegrams, and just to give a little bit of background, the Willie-Nicky telegrams were the correspondence between Russia and Germany before World War I began. And the two of them were related. The two of them were cousins. But there's one piece of this that often isn't discussed, and that's that secretly behind closed doors, both countries were mobilizing for warfare because they knew if war did break out, they wanted to be the first to strike. Remember, it's that idea of the cult of the offensive. If you can take the war to the other side before they can take it to you, that's going to give you a large advantage. And in a conflict where, again, under this idea of social Darwinism, in a conflict where your nation's survival is at stake, you want to be sure that you are going to strike first. Some of these philosophies, too, were enhanced by the geopolitical circumstances. So, for example, Germany and Austria-Hungary really feared Russia, and they thought if Russia could get up and rolling in terms of mobilization, that Germany was really going to have, and Austria too, were really going to have a lot of trouble on their hands. That necessitated a quick, decisive strike, which led to less time to really think about the ramifications of warfare. All countries also believed they had something to gain from the war, which incentivized participating in the conflict. Germany believed they would become the most powerful country in the world. Britain believed they needed to participate in order to prevent Germany from becoming the most powerful country in the world. France needed to avenge its losses from the Franco-Prussian War. Russia needed to avenge its losses and redeem itself for its defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. Austria-Hungary needed to avenge Franz Ferdinand's assassination in Serbia. Not to mention the added benefit of potentially adding Serbia. Italy believed they were backing the winning side and could add land from Austria. And the Ottomans, well, the Ottomans, I guess, could crush internal dissent. They were sort of dragged into the conflict a little bit. Last, and although there is some evidence that there were people who were certainly against going to war in World War I, much of the population didn't have a real idea of what World War I would be like. They saw the idea of war as heroic and something to be celebrated. And I'll read you a section real quick about this time period. The mood in Europe was of war. Everyone talked about the inevitability of it, and soldiers sang about it. Many felt that war was a fine, heroic thing, an experience where gentlemen proved their worth. Each country in the war was caught up in national pride and national positioning. Countries could see no way of turning back and believed they had more to gain from war than from peace. When misunderstandings occurred in the pre-war climate, one can see how the onset of World War I was inevitable. So just to sum up everything we went over before we move on to the other side, we have an overzealous adherence to alliances with foreign countries. We have the ideas of social Darwinism applied to nations, leading to the cultivation of the offensive mentality of the generals of the time. We also have the belief that nations themselves were superior to one another and that the nations had a lot to gain from war. And then last, the attitudes of the people, which did not match the realities of modern warfare. The lack of expectation to know exactly what to expect and exactly how terrible conflict would be. So now the opposing side, where we're going to go over some factors against war starting in 1914. In 1910, a best-selling book called The Great Illusion used economic arguments to demonstrate that territorial conquest had become unprofitable, and therefore capitalism had removed the risk of major wars. This does follow conventional wisdom. Even in modern times, analysts often feel that economic interdependence between countries precludes war because it would just be too detrimental to all sides involved. In addition to economic factors being a disincentive to causing a larger war, we also do have some attempts to avert the war. The Willie-Nicky telegrams is probably the most oft-cited one. The issue with the Willie-Nicky telegrams is that some of the communication was being taken by more warlike subordinates rather than the leaders themselves. If perhaps there was more direct communication, war may have been averted. For example, had the leaders been aware of perhaps the consequences of their decisions, they may not have decided to go to war. Simply put, if the leaders had received some advice on perhaps what the country could have lost rather than discussing what the country could gain through war, then maybe the war could have been averted. One might think that unrealistic given the context of the first part of this video. However, I think it's important to keep in mind that Europe had avoided major warfare before. At the Berlin Conference in 1884, Europe did not have a massive conflict over highly sought after colonies in Africa, unfortunately at Africa's expense. In addition, there had been several crises in the Balkans in the early 1900s that were successfully worked out through diplomacy. It's not out of the realm of possibility that diplomacy could have been used yet again to work out the issues of 1914. So I think it's only fair if I do attack probably the most commonly cited argument in favor of the war being inevitable, because in the other section I did decide to attack the Willie-Nicky telegrams, which is usually the most cited evidence that the war was not inevitable. The most commonly cited argument in favor of the war being inevitable is that the demands that Austria-Hungary put on Serbia after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand were totally unacceptable to Serbia and could never have worked out. And I want to talk about those terms a little bit just because I don't know that the perception matches up to the reality of the situation. So although the conventional wisdom is that Austria-Hungary's demands were unreasonable, Serbia actually acceded to the vast majority of their demands and only really protested against two of them. One of them was that Serbian officials, which were unnamed, should be dismissed at Austria-Hungary's request. And the second one was that Austro-Hungarian officials should take part on Serbian soil in proceedings against organizations hostile to Austria-Hungary. Serbia didn't even give these two demands an outright no. They just wanted to submit the issue to international arbitration. In other words, have other countries help come to a diplomatic solution. Now, Austria-Hungary did reject that suggestion to submit to international arbitration, but remember, Germany had immense influence over Austria-Hungary. If they would have put down some pressure and said, hey, you need to go to international arbitration, there's a pretty good chance that they would have done it. Additionally, even if war had broken out, there was no guarantee that it was going to engulf the entire continent as it did, had cooler heads prevailed at other steps along the way in diplomacy. Given the fact that all these events kind of had to happen all at once, there's an argument to be made that actually our real timeline is a much less likely outcome than a number of others that could have occurred from the situation. In fact, a lot of historians discuss how the situation was improving diplomatically leading up to 1914. The Moroccan crisis had been settled, the French and the Germans had concluded an agreement over the Rhine River, And at the time of the assassination, the German Navy was actually hosting the British Navy at Kiel Week, which is a huge party with yacht and boat races. And let's face it, there's no guarantee that these countries were going to be loyal to their supposed alliances. After all, look at what Italy did. As we discussed, Germany didn't have to back Austria-Hungary, Russia didn't have to back Serbia, France didn't have to back Russia, and Britain really could have stayed out of this conflict altogether. More than a few things had to happen to change the situation from one of calm to one of chaos. So, to give you the too long didn't want to watch version, economic interdependence made war perceived as unprofitable, diminishing the likelihood of conflict. Direct communication may have also diminished the likelihood of conflict if the leaders would have talked to each other rather than going through more aggressive intermediaries. The perception that Austria-Hungary made unrealistic and unacceptable demands may be inaccurate. If international arbitration had been accepted, the conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia may have been worked out diplomatically. And last, even if conflict had broken out, countries were not necessarily bound by their alliances to jump in. The situation in 1914 actually seemed to be one of relative calm compared to previous eras. Tensions were largely on the decline, not on the rise. Here comes the criticism, because I'm going to go ahead and hedge my conclusion here. I do believe that the long-term factors made war unavoidable. However, I don't think that the war needed to be fought at that moment in 1914. With that question answered, we can get back to the original one, which is, what would the world look like had World War I been avoided in 1914? And at this point, you're welcome to tell me that I'm full of utter nonsense, because, of course, this is all conjecture from this point on. So here it is. Hopefully, if it's nonsense, at the very least, it's entertaining nonsense. So we're going to try to do all this in a single take, and we'll see how it goes. So what would this world have looked like? The only way to avoid war in 1914 would have been for international arbitration to be accepted. The parties likely would have mediated some sort of settlement that would have placated Austria-Hungary and would have left Serbia extremely weak. In the long term, likely within a decade or so, a major war was still likely to occur. The rise of militarism and imperialism was too much that pretty much any international issue between countries threatened the tenuous stability of the entirety of the continent. However, with this war being delayed, I think there's a lot of second and third order effects that become very important. First off, I would predict that the war would be fought with similar technology to that of World War I. The reason that I say that is war is usually an accelerant to technology, and the fact that the war would have happened later would mean that military technology would not have had the incentive to develop at the rate that it did in our original timeline. Whether or not Russia decides to fight in this massive war that happens, whenever it does happen, like I said, within the next decade, I do think that a government change outside of a czarist regime was going to occur probably within a decade. So no matter what happens with the war, I think that Tsar Nicholas II and the Romanovs will not rule Russia in the long haul. I would imagine probably the Social Democrats actually have a pretty good chance as the successors to the Russian state, because the Bolsheviks primarily capitalized on the weakness of the government during a time of war in order to win. If the Social Democrats are able to depose the Romanovs before this world war in our adjusted timeline, they're probably much closer to the regimes of France and Britain. Now, whether this delay in the conflict helps or hurts Germany would depend on the timing of the conflict. Even a German victory in the new war probably would not have a lasting impact. Germany was already a conglomeration of too many people who had nationalistic dreams and desires of independence within their country. We pan around to the rest of the world. The US and Japan probably have a timeline that's not altered too seriously. You will have economic troubles probably after the World War I that happens 10 years later than our original timeline. But when it comes to the rise of these two countries militarily and the Pacific empires that both of these countries were building, probably not too much changes. After the war ends, I really can't forecast beyond that. I don't even think my current forecast is accurate, given the fact that we're already extrapolating so much from what exactly this conflict would look like. If I'm being forced to guess, I think we're left with a world that more closely resembles the world we live in today. Any victory Germany would have would be offset by a balkanization effect of European nationalism. And I think in the long run, there's no way that a large German empire would hold in Europe with the threat of Britain and France from the east, from the west, and Russia from the east. My script screwed that up. On a very timely note, I think that the Spanish flu circulates the globe more slowly because I think that World War I, again, acting as an accelerant for many things in our historical timeline, assisted in the spread of the Spanish flu globally. So globalization would have been more limited. The disease was still spread, but probably not as quickly, probably lessening the death toll. Keep in mind, the entire video and everything that I just said is all conjecture. This is one issue that I've always had with extrapolating historically. It's hard to know exactly what would have happened since the reality is World War I did occur. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand did, in reality, prove a spark on the tinderbox of Europe that led to the destruction of the 1914 world order. Here we stand in our own daunting times, not altogether different from those before us. There are rising tensions between countries internationally, pretty much all over the world. It is my hope that it will not take the catastrophes of the first half of the 20th century to escape the issues that we face in the 21st, and that we can find a better way forward to improvement globally.